I think we're ready. Sorry for the delay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to SOA. Thank you for coming on this blustery night. You're all very welcome, and thanks for choosing this event. I know there's a bunch of really interesting events on tonight. I know there's an interesting event on Bangladesh. I know the Rethinking Economics guys are having a meeting, so thank you for choosing to come here. My name's Liz May. I work at Development Leadership Dialogue. So for those of you not familiar, DLD was set up just over a year ago. We're just about to have our 1-year anniversary by my colleague Ha-Joon Chang, who's joining us online, and Professor Christopher Kramer and Dr. Jonathan Dijon. And DLD was set up really to try and bring diverse actors together, to try and bust some myths, to try and break people a little bit out of their silos, in order to think a little bit more creatively and a little bit more strategically about some really difficult development challenges. Part of my role at DLD is to put together these events and think about like what kind of topics we might want to cover. And when I was thinking about, well, what's a really thorny, difficult development challenge that we haven't managed to solve, this issue came to mind, this issue of how intellectual property rights, the intellectual property regime affects the ability for people all over the world to be able to access safe and affordable medicines has been a problem throughout my whole career. So I first started working on this issue back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when I was working at an organization called Action for Southern Africa. And at that time, the AIDS epidemic was absolutely ravaging the African continent, and in particular, Southern Africa. You had a situation where roughly 1 in 3 working age people in Swaziland were HIV positive or had AIDS. We had this whole generation of AIDS orphans that was being created. But meanwhile, in the UK, people were able to access antiretrovirals. They were able to access the treatments that they needed. And I remember having a conversation with a colleague called Mark Hayward, who worked then at the Treatment Action Campaign, one of the great South African campaigning organizations. And I was saying, you know, it's so frustrating sitting here in London. What can we do? How can we support? You know, what can we do about this epidemic, which is devastating your country? And he was racking his brains and he said, you know, there is this court case happening. And he explained to me how GlaxoSmithKline at the time were trying to block the South African government from putting in place legislation which would allow it to import generic versions of the medicines that they needed for their population. And I remember how I felt, how shocked I was that it was possible, I mean, forget the morals of this, that it was possible or viable that a company could try and block the legislation of a democratically elected government, particularly at that time with everything that was happening with the AIDS epidemic. So you think this is really shocking. And you think, you know, we made some progress around the time of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and we got the TRIPS waiver and certain things happened. But then came the COVID epidemic. And again, you think, surely this time, this is going to be the time that we actually fix how intellectual property affects the ability of people all over the world to access medicines. But yet again, we failed. And again, now you can see with other diseases, Mpox and others, people are not getting the access to medicines, and intellectual property is a big part of that problem. So this topic is exactly the kind of thing that DLD was set up to try and discuss. And part of what we also try and do is bring together people with different experiences from different sectors, different backgrounds. So we've just got the most amazing panel tonight. So Els is a scientist by training. Nick is an activist, but also, you know, a real political strategist. And we've got Ha-Joon online, who's obviously an economist. So we're trying to bring those different voices together to try and have this more kind of creative and strategic discussion about this difficult development challenge. So my challenge to you guys in the audience and for us here is, as you're listening and as you're thinking about, you know, questions you might want to ask, try and get your strategic thinking heads on. You know, what are we not doing right? What are the stories we're not telling? What are the vested interests that we're not properly analysing? How are we miscommunicating this problem? And, you know, what can we do better and more strategically in the future? So that's my challenge to you. I'll introduce the panel, and then how it will work. Els will speak for 20-25 minutes, then Nick and Ha-Joon will respond, they'll add their perspectives, and then I'll be keeping an eye on the time so that we can make sure we've got loads of time for a proper conversation between ourselves, between the panelists as well. So, you know, do think about the questions that you're gonna want to ask. So let me introduce Els, who's joined us tonight from Geneva. So thank you so much for traveling. Els has a PhD in biomedical science, and she's now an independent researcher and advisor. She's the founding director of EQUA, a think space on equity and economic justice for health. She's worked on issues relating to medical innovation, access to medicines with Médecins Sans Frontières, the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, which I believe she helped to set up. She's also worked with the Open Society Foundation, and she has an affiliation with UCL, University College London. So very welcome, Els. Nick. Nick is a long friend and director of Global Justice Now. Perfect person to have on the panel tonight, as he's just, was it last year, brought out the book Pharmanomics. So I see he has no copies, or he does have a copy or two. Yeah. Nick has been a campaigner for years for global economic justice, with War on Want, with Amnesty International, with Drop the Debt. And he's been a leading voice in the People's Vaccine Campaign. He was also a leading voice in the campaign against TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It's been a long time since I've had to say that. And Ha-Joon, who unfortunately is really not well tonight and has very, very kindly agreed to join us online from his sickbed. But Ha-Joon, last but not least, is a research professor here at SOAS, co-director of the DLD, and he is the author of numerous books on economics, the political economy of industrial policy, Kicking Away the Ladder, Bad Samaritans, which I think is my favorite, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, and Economics, the User's Guide. And his latest book is Edible Economics, and Ha-Joon's writings have been translated and published in 45 languages in 46 countries. So we're absolutely delighted that Ha-Joon is joining us. Thanks, Ha-Joon, we really appreciate it. But that is all from me. If everything is working okay, I will hand over to Els. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for this very nice and generous introduction. And I hadn't realized because we only met today, that your involvement with access to medicines also dates back from the time with South Africa, Mark Haywood, etc. So we must have lived some parallel lives there. And so indeed, I have a long background working around access to medicines, but being a scientist, a medical scientist myself, my approach has always been more from how can we ensure that the medical innovation ecosystem delivers medicines that are available affordably and equitably from the start, because we have for over 20 years or plus always tried to kind of have the medical innovation as is and then trying to solve the access issue afterwards. Well, my conclusion is that doesn't work. We need to go back to actually how do we develop medicines and how the pharmaceutical ecosystem works. And so what I will do in the next 20-25 minutes is indeed laying out a little bit what is wrong with the current system. And given that I talk, including to Professor Ha-Joon, economists, I think that like many economists have said that GDP is not an appropriate measure to actually measure economic growth in a way that is conducive for human and planetary development. My argument is that in the same way, the pharmaceutical sector, the way we measure their success is not conducive for public health. We all assume that pharmaceuticals are there for our health, that the pharmaceutical sector output will improve health. And I hope to convince you that we got that a little bit wrong, and that actually at the heart of that is indeed intellectual property rights and patents, and how they have actually been instrumentalized towards that. And so I hope by the end to convince you in ways to think a little bit differently about the economics underlying medical innovation and to reclaim medicines and medical innovation for our health. But let me backtrack a little bit, if this works. How do I? Now it does. To start maybe with the obvious, pharmaceuticals, medicines, vaccines, diagnostics are not ordinary commodities. And it may sound very logic to you, but you will see that that is important to reiterate. And so, given that they are part of achieving the right to health, it means that it's a public and so government, a political responsibility to ensure that we have medical innovation and the availability of pharmaceuticals to indeed achieve the right to health. And that means we need timely, equitable, and affordable access. It also means, and again, I may cite the obvious here, that the purpose of health innovation and of pharmaceuticals is improve people's health and well-being. And so that means that the question in the end for policymakers is, how do you organize your industrial ecosystem, your scientific ecosystem, such that indeed it can deliver that? And there are many ways to do that. And so I want to emphasize that it is a political choice to do it in a certain way or another. And just to remind you that we have been very good at mobilizing science and scientific progress for public health impact. And I just show here a few very critical breakthrough inventions, penicillin and all the other antibiotics that followed, insulin, polio vaccine. This dates from a time when we thought that scientific progress for public health indeed was meant to be widely available for everybody. However, that has changed over the years. And what we've seen is actually that the pharmaceutical R&D ecosystem has moved from a health purpose to a profit motive. And as I already said, in the good part of the 20th century, and especially the period around the 1950s and 70s, there's been a wealth of amazing breakthroughs in biomedical research and medicine, such that we have the golden age, as we call it, of antibiotics and vaccines that were typically made widely available and affordably and had a major public health progress. However, what we've seen, and that is mostly since the 1980s, as part of the neoliberal shift, the initiative and the driving force for biomedical research is left to the private sector, under the assumption that was then very popular, that the market is the most effective allocator of resources, so you need to leave it to the private sector. Also assuming that entrepreneurialism of the private sector will be the best driving force for medical innovation. And as a consequence, of course, what we saw is that we had a purpose of maximizing sales, revenue, and profit that starts to overtake biomedical research. And when we look today, added to that has been an increasing financialization, and where the ultimate purpose, and I'll come back to that with some more evidence, has become maximizing capital gains for shareholders and investors. And what that all has done is, of course, it has created a very profitable pharmaceutical sector. This is one publication showing on the upper line how the revenues of the pharmaceutical sector have been gradually going up and up. So that worked very well. Now, because of the health purpose from the beginning, the policymakers have made a lot of effort to actually incentivize that private sector, to de-risk the private sector, to subsidize. In green, there is a whole series of government policies and financing that has been put into this mix under the assumption that it's possible to create a win-win between getting our health needs addressed through biomedical research and also responding to the economic and financial imperatives of pharmaceutical companies. And these include also very generous intellectual property policies, but also finances for research and development, for education of researchers, of medical staff, of hospitals, a lot of procurement support, because we have a third-party payer for most of our medicines. All of that is put into this mix of the assumed win-win. However, what we can see today is that in reality, we have a growing misalignment between, at one hand, where the dominant emphasis is economic and financial interests of the companies, versus the health needs that remain largely under addressed. And just to give you a few examples, plenty of unmet medical needs remain unaddressed. And I think the most important that we are talking about today is antibiotics. There is increasing antibiotic resistance. It's a major health crisis already today, and maybe in a few years from now, a simple surgery will become again life-threatening because we don't have new antibiotics. Does that highly subsidized pharmaceutical sector develops new antibiotics? No, they don't think it's profitable enough, so they don't do that. On the other hand, what they do develop, and there are new medical breakthroughs, not as many as they claim, but there are. But what happens is they are so expensive that even wealthy health systems like in Europe are no longer able to afford it. It used to be expensive when we're talking about HIV/AIDS 20 years ago. $10,000 per person per year was considered too expensive. Today, it would be a bargain. Today, new medicines come onto the market at 500,000, $1 million. The last rare disease therapies were 1.5 to 3 million for a single treatment. It's completely ridiculous. At the same time, what we also see is that a growing number of medicines that exist, older medicines that are actually not so expensive, are no longer available. They're just taken out of the market because companies prefer to manufacture the very expensive one where they can make much more profit than the old ones that exist already. And then a fourth element that is underappreciated, that is, if you look at the outcome of medical innovation and judge them according to whether they actually provide any therapeutic benefits, whether they're any better than what we have already, then we see, and there has been multiple studies now, that more than half of it, more than half of the new treatments that get to the market do not provide any medical benefit compared to what we have already. So it's an enormously wasteful system, but it also means that, again, all these incentives work very well to create drugs that actually we don't really need. So they're showing how wrong we are with the incentives. And then last but not least, I think COVID has reminded us how badly we are in providing medical innovations in an equitable way. And this is a cartoon of one of my favorite cartoonists, Chapat. He's from Geneva, from Switzerland, who has an ability to really pinpoint very simply what it's about, and that you will remember from during COVID. So what we see is that we have actually a total misalignment in the measures of success for the pharmaceutical sector. And on the left side, and this is the maximizing pharmaceutical company profits and shareholder value, where you need to prioritize the most profitable, which doesn't mean the same as prioritizing unmet health needs. Or maximizing revenues via pricing is kind of contradictory to getting affordable and equitable access. And there are a few more things that I will illustrate in the next slides. For instance, how the economic incentives promote over-medicalization, including of harmful products. And you will be aware of, we don't hear much about it anymore nowadays, but a few years ago, the opioid overdose epidemic that happened in the United States, in part pushed by marketing by pharmaceutical companies who sold prescription drugs based on opioids, and that created an enormous epidemic of deaths in the US. Similarly, there are major scandals, and this is only one, Vioxx, where a company has pushed the marketing of a drug, even if it knew that there were harmful side effects, in this case, cardiac side effects, and it has taken years before that drug was taken out of the market, creating harm for thousands, if not millions of people. And increasingly, we see also companies through marketing, because they put a lot of money into marketing, telling us that we have diseases that we don't even know exists. I mean, a famous example is the restless leg syndrome. You know, some people that tend to kind of move their leg a little bit. There are even marketing campaigns trying to tell you that actually it's a disease for which they have a treatment. But I think especially in everything related to mental health, there is an over-marketing of drugs of which we don't even know whether they work, and often with harmful side effects. Now, also very importantly is that they tell us always that they need all these expensive medicines to invest in R&D, because otherwise we will not have the innovation we need for tomorrow. Well, they don't really invest that much in R&D. And this is the same graph I showed you a little bit earlier, where you can see, yes, there's also been a steady increase in the money spent on R&D, which probably includes mergers and acquisitions. That was not very clear from these data. But in any case, it's only a minor fraction of the revenues that are spent on R&D. And Bill Lazonik, who I think is also associated with Socio University, has done a lot of work showing how pharmaceutical companies spend more on buying back their own shares to artificially keep the share price high than actually on R&D, or at the same time, either share buybacks or paying out dividends to the shareholders, but not so much in R&D. And so this financialization is really means actually that a lot of money that goes in either through government subsidies or by us paying high prices is extracted and going to shareholders and investors, not going back into the medical innovation ecosystem to get us better treatments. There are also increasingly either hedge fund managers or venture capital firms that play around with a portfolio of early biotech and biomed companies or portfolios, actually just trying to make more money. And this was one example, that just a hedge fund that bought during COVID from a university a drug candidate that showed some promise for COVID, and within a month managed to sell it back to a big company at a much higher price. And so this has nothing to do with actually productive R&D. Famous example of how government funding gets extracted, or the value created by government funding that gets extracted. Moderna, I think it was well documented that nearly all the investments in the development of the COVID vaccine was government funding. In addition to 20 years of many scientists that contributed, well, Moderna was able to monetize that, and I can't see the figures. It's kind of like the 21 and 22, almost 20 billion revenues. These were the biggest blockbusters ever, totally based on developments with government funding. And then finally, the way that companies also prioritize lifelong treatments over cures. And there is a famous quote by Goldman Sachs that actually when the hepatitis C drug sofosbuvir was on the market, which was a breakthrough drug that could cure hepatitis C, which was a long uncurable chronic disease, that actually said, well, it was, by the way, a very expensive drug, but after a while, all the people with hepatitis C were treated, and it was like, this is not a good business case, because actually we take away the illness, and that's not good for business. And so reminding us that actually the pharmaceutical companies, they have not so much interest in creating cures, but they want customers, and preferably lifelong customers. And so all of that doesn't seem to go into alignment with public health, right? And then finally, and I showed there already, the fact that Me Too drugs, so Me Too means like no medical therapeutic breakthrough, no advance, just more of the same. This is a study in Germany showing the same thing as I showed before, that actually the large majority, so over 50% of new drugs, have no added value, no proof of added benefits at the moment that they are being registered. And so it's much more profitable for a company to do that than actually to investing in the more risky research that is needed to get their breakthroughs. Similarly, another strategy is patent evergreening. IMAC, which is a New York-based NGO, has done amazing work documenting how many patents on just one single drug, which is Humira, which is a blockbuster drug, an anti-inflammatory. And they show that actually there have been a total of 274 patents filed on this one drug. And most importantly, almost 90% of them were filed after the drug was already on the market. So if you think about patents that are supposed to reward novelty and inventiveness, I'm not sure when the drug is already on the market, how you can make that happen. But the result is that the monopoly period is now already confirmed to be 39 years instead of the 20 years that should have been at the max. And this is until 33, so we will see by then, maybe there will be new patents that will even prolong it further. Prices that are just going up and up and up. We mentioned insulin. When it was initially developed, it was very affordably available. Meanwhile, the few companies that have a monopoly or a duo or a triopoly, monopoly, or how you call that, on insulin, they have been raising prices just in parallel. So economics 101, the longer a drug is on the market or the more competition, that prices will go down. Well, obviously that doesn't work in medicines where they find all kinds of ways to be able to charge ever higher prices. And I mentioned already the hepatitis C drug, sofosbuvir, when it came to market, admittedly a breakthrough drug, but it was $80,000 for a 3-month treatment. And so this is from a campaign poster of Médecins Sans Frontières, where they said, gram for gram, these hepatitis C drugs is 67 times more expensive than gold. So that means that we have a significant misallocation of our innovative and productive capacity. In today's economy, it's capital that controls what is being developed and brought to market. Not medical needs, not your needs, not our needs, not global needs, just capital. And in fact, there has been a very interesting study commissioned by the Dutch government and actually done by a private consultancy company that cannot be accused of being sympathetic to the activist view, that actually concludes, yes, indeed, looking at the whole landscape and all the venture capital that primarily dominates the early space of R&D, that a drug's expected financial return determines whether it will be developed or not. And so it's totally crazy, right? So that means that capital just only flows to those technologies and companies that will deliver the highest financial return. And I quote here something that I heard Professor Ha-Joon say once, that it's de facto $1, one vote, not one person or one health need, one vote, but $1, one vote. And it also means that our brightest minds and scientists are not working towards improving health. If we could only ask them to develop new antibiotics or new treatments for or vaccines for Marburg and etc. No, they are serving capital because that's where the money is going. And to give one example, and you know that in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of tech billionaires, and there is a very hot area of research there that they are financing, which is they want to live forever. Either just biomedical research to on longevity or something, I don't know how you pronounce that, to live long, or also increasingly kind of these tech extensions and you know, loading up your brains into the computer and all of that. But there is a lot of money going to these type of things, much more than to critical health needs that we have. And so one major tool for capital to achieve all of that I've been saying is intellectual property rights, patent monopolies on the products, technologies, technology platform, know-how, everything increasingly. And I just want to make a few basic comments on this, because patents and intellectual property rights in general is actually been the enclosure and the monetization of something that was a common. I mean, knowledge, like land long time ago, but knowledge, and that's much more recent, used to be a commons that was available for the benefit of all. And scientific progress was also long based on sharing, exchanging. I mean, I did my PhD in the 1990s, and it was the moment that we were asked to start patenting our research, and we were all like, what do you mean? Like, why would we patent our research? We want to publish, we want to share, we want to go to conferences, we want to actually learn from each other and build our biomedical knowledge together. But that's changed, and I want to emphasize how recent that was, that actually knowledge got privatized into intellectual property, mostly patents, but not only, and to serve as the basis of the knowledge-based economy, which is another neoliberal invention. And one very critical element to that was in 1980 that the US passed the Bayh-Dole Act that actually allowed publicly funded research to be patented, so to be privatized as a tool then to license to the industry, the private industry, that then would put private capital. And the only reason why they put private capital is because they could make gains, and then we come back to what I was saying before. But that Bayh-Dole Act that then was taken over by all the European countries and now many countries in the world has actually kind of made it possible for all that publicly supported knowledge to become privatized as an asset for private capital. And so we go from science as a collective effort to a winner takes it all, because the patent, I mean, think about the COVID, the mRNA patents. How come that Moderna is able to capture, privatize the result of actually 20 years of research by many other people than actually before Moderna even exists? Because that's the way the patent, you capture the end result, but then actually all the rest you take along. And then another really important element was in 1995 when the World Trade Organization forced through what we call the TRIPS agreement, stands for trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, that actually globalized minimal patents standards to all the countries. And I'll come back to that, because that, I think, has been a real good example of kicking away the ladder, Ha-Joon, if I may cite you again, because there was such an unequal, at that moment, technological capability in the world, certainly around pharmaceuticals, and not by coincidence, it was amongst others Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies that pushed for this agreement, that then locked actually all the countries into this inequality of wealthy countries being able to have patents and innovate, and the rest of the world not. Now, I want to emphasize that unlike the term intellectual property rights says, that they are neither a property, neither a right. Actually, intellectual property rights are a policy tool that governments can use, and they exist already for a long time, but it's only very recent that they've been used so much around knowledge for the knowledge-based economy. And so a policy tool by states to actually incentivize innovation and the dissemination of technology. We've kind of carefully forgotten that second part, because we only think and talk about incentivizing innovation. And also in exchange for disclosure, which also we forget about, because even if a patent is supposedly published, if you ever read a patent, you can see that it's unreadable, it's full of falsehoods, it's lies, it's not true what is in a patent, so it's not really disclosed. Anyway, all that to say is that the question then is, pharmaceutical patents, are they an adequate policy tool for public health? And I think what I've shown you so far, and I see several of you nodding no, I don't need to add anything more, probably not, right? Now, the problem is that patents, as the core incentive of medical innovation, are really key to drive this misalignment. And the reason is that what can be patented strictly according to the law, has nothing to do with what brings therapeutic benefit to the patients. Because what can be patented, actually everything that is a chemical novelty, a novelty is really the essence of patenting. And then it needs to be innovative, but that is such a flu term that even a combination of two existing drugs can be patented. I mean, nobody that knows anything about medicines would consider that innovative, but novelty is the real thing. But you don't need to show that what you want to patent brings therapeutic benefit. You don't need to actually address health priorities. You don't need to ensure access, affordability, or knowledge share. So none of the things we need for public health are needed for a patent. So what we get, because patents are really at the drive of medical innovation, is that the financial and economic value of patents as tradable assets, increasingly and monetizable, gets the priority rather than public health value. And so all the economic incentives that we've talked about are all geared towards financial and economic value, and none of them are actually looking at public health value. And just to say that there used to be a couple of countries in Europe where in order to register your drug, you needed to show added therapeutic benefits. But that has, after a lot of lobbying of the pharmaceutical companies, all been cleared away. Now you do not need to show that. You can show that it works compared to a placebo, or you can show something else. You do not have to show that. And that's, I think, I mean, it would be a tiny thing to change, but what makes a lot of difference. But of course, there are reasons why we are in the situation we are. And so that's how I come that we need to really reclaim not only the narrative, but also really the health purpose of medical innovation. And a lot there revolves around freedom to operate. And so I've been working with many others over the last years, trying to put forward some ways in which we can actually think about how can we empower the scientists and the researchers to use their minds to address health needs. And so certainly in the context of epidemic and pandemic preparedness, where again, the global south was left behind, there is a strong willingness there of actually building regional R&D hubs where scientists and developers work together to actually address the health needs that they have. But for that, they need to be equipped with the means to do that. They need the freedom to operate, they need access to the technology, they need access to appropriate finance, such that they can actually deliver on that public health mission. And something has fallen off my slide, which I think is around governance. You need a governance of all of that has as the objective public health purpose, not monetary value. And so in conclusion, I think what we need is really rethink our narrative towards a new social contract, but realizing how wrong our current social contract works, and basically say, well, the critical health technologies and the underlying knowledge, they should be considered global commons. They can't be privately held commodities. It's about our health. So we need to somehow free that knowledge from its private enclosure such that it can be used again for public health. And one easy thing to do, if the politics were different, would be to create a health exemption at the World Trade Organization, at the TRIPS agreement. And again, before 1995, there were countries who did not accept patents on pharmaceuticals. And by the way, Switzerland, the country where I live now, Pharmaland, until the 1970s, they did not have patents on pharmaceuticals. India didn't have patents on pharmaceuticals. There were countries that didn't have patents in health. So we can go back. It's not as if we do something crazy. It used to be different. So I think that would be really making a big difference. And then ensure that we get public health needs-driven research and development and priority setting instead of what is today the capital that controls it. But that requires, and this is an invitation to all the economists in the room and at home on their sickbed, I think we need to retake the economic logic underpinning health innovation, that it needs to focus on bringing health value and therapeutic benefits, equity, all these things instead of monetary value. And that we can do that through fostering collective intelligence and collaboration rather than what we have today, this proprietary competition, winner takes it all, one size fits all these economic things of efficiency, they don't work for health. We want multiple solutions for the same thing. We want redundancy for public health value. And then I think there is no escape from public financing for health. And again, that opens a whole pot of other worms that I'm not going to go into, but this idea that there is no money, the public cannot create money while the private sector is creating money. Private banks are creating money all the time. Like, let's create money for health purpose and spend it in that way. And so all that to say is that we need to design a whole of government approach. There is no quick fix here in the margins, but really turn back that narrative and say, well, we need a social contract for pharmaceutical innovation that delivers equitable access by design. I'm going to leave it there because I've been already too long. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Els. I mean, that's just kicked us off to such an amazing start. So comprehensive, so thoughtful, so challenging, lots of setting out of the problem and some hints towards the solutions. I'm going to hand straight over to Nick. Do you want to? I mean, yeah, in the interest of time, let's just keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'll try not to be too long. And I have to be too long because Els has said everything. Really, which is not a surprise. It's an honor to be speaking with you, Els, because it really is because of the expertise of people like you who've worked on this kind of thing for such a long time that we're able to campaign at all for a better system. And it's also a great honor to be on a panel with Ha-Joon Chang, because anyone who's worked on the global economy or trade from a critical perspective, I think, has drawn from the work that he's done over the years. And I want to kind of pull out some of those lessons as well for the trade system as a whole, because I think that this stuff is kind of most obvious when you're talking about something like medicines, but actually it has repercussions on the entire economy, how we deal with climate change, and so on and so forth. So look, I got into all of this, well, a bit before COVID actually, but when COVID hit, you know, we were really worried because we knew how the pharmaceutical corporations behaved, how they were structured, that there was a real danger that there was going to be a repeat of this Southern African moment in the 80s, where, you know, we had the medicines to cure people, or at least to indefinitely prolong their lives and prevent the spread of HIV, and yet those people were not able to access it, we were not able to afford it. And we were worried the same thing was going to happen with COVID, and unfortunately that fear turned out to be well-founded. These corporations are incredibly profitable. I mean, they are way more profitable than the average company. I mean, I think that something like 3 times the average profit level of the big corporations listed on the US stock exchange, the pharmaceutical companies, which explains why, you know, Pfizer at one point during the pandemic was making $50 billion a year just off its COVID products. Several members of Moderna's board became billionaires off the one product they had on the market, which was the COVID vaccine. But for me, and I think Els has demonstrated it, really, that's not even the core of the problem. The core of the problem is the monopoly power that intellectual property rights gives these corporations, allows them to effectively take public decisions in private interest. Right? So, which is in some definitions the very definition of corruption, right? Public decisions taken for private interest. That's what happens with our medicines, and you could see it in COVID in terms of the corporations. It wasn't simply they weren't selling their products, that by and large they hadn't invented, by the way. So Pfizer's vaccine. I mean, there's a great quote that was in the Financial Times at the time by a negotiator in Biden's administration who was trying to buy the vaccine, and Pfizer was trying to charge $100 a dose, so about $200 per patient, for a vaccine that the American government had put enormous amounts of money into. And you can see this poor guy kind of tearing his hair out, saying it's not even their vaccine. The fact we call it Pfizer's vaccine must be the biggest marketing coup in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. And if Pfizer's vaccine wasn't Pfizer's vaccine, Moderna's vaccine was even less Moderna's vaccine, and AstraZeneca's vaccine was even less AstraZeneca's vaccine. Right, so they were making huge amounts of money off medicines that they hadn't actually created. They essentially saw their interests as restricting the supply so that they maintained control of the monopolies on those medicines. And what that meant was not only that they were selling them very unfairly. I mean, in the first wave, Moderna and Pfizer sold virtually nothing to the global south, and it all went to Western governments. Well, that's bad enough. But even worse, they wouldn't simply share the technology behind those vaccines and help train others up so that they could make them. And there was supposedly great research done in the pandemic where there were 100 factories and laboratories around the world that could safely have produced mRNA vaccines. And these companies absolutely refused to share that. And I think that is just the most atrocious way of making decisions around vaccine rollouts in the worst pandemic in a century. And it demonstrates beautifully how problematic the capture of public decision-making is by the pharmaceutical industry. So I wanted to look, as a result of all this, I wrote this book because I was absolutely determined to tell a different story to the one that was being told by our leaders. Because our leaders, particularly our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who had this wonderful little phrase, which was, "It was greed, my friend, that got us out of the pandemic," was just completely untrue. What got us out of the pandemic was phenomenal amounts of public spending, many years of scientists, often paid with public money, university funds doing a lot of research. What greed did was create this inequality that, although it was less bad for those of us in the West who were at least able to get hold of the vaccines, still was a problem for us because it was allowing this disease to spread across parts of the world where there were no vaccines and potentially mutate and come back and override the vaccines that we have been able to get. So it was absolutely awful for all of us. But what I wanted to do was tell that different story about how the vaccines had been created with, as I say, huge amounts of public expertise and public money. But what I found in doing that research was this core point that I think Els has already talked about, but let me put it really simply: that effectively you have a bunch of companies here who we all think of as medical research companies. They have this killer argument which they love, which is like, imagine life without us. You might not like us, you might not like the way we profit, you might not like the cost of our goods, but at least we produce them. And it's frightening to imagine a world without modern medicine. So it works. It's a very effective argument. But what I discovered in writing the book was that they don't. That effectively they don't produce the medicine. That actually, far from being medical research companies today, they are more like hedge funds. Essentially. They buy up companies, they buy up medicines, they buy up the intellectual property that goes with them, and they squeeze it for all it's worth, extending those monopolies for as long as they possibly can, creating Me Too drugs, and so on and so forth. And I think it's a really important, I found it a really important insight because it undercuts this central argument that they've used since back in the 1960s, when there was a real possibility in the United States that they were going to be properly regulated. And intellectual property, even in the US, the home of intellectual property, even in the US, they were going to seriously limit their intellectual property provision. They went on an absolute PR spree to convince people, at least you have the medicines. So what I wanted to find out was how this change had come about, this financialization that Els talked about, because there was a golden age of medicines, although I still think a lot of the companies behaved very badly in that period, and the opioid epidemic is a great example, of a company that essentially came up with something not very different from heroin, and then convinced doctors that there was no addictive qualities to this medicine whatsoever, and they should prescribe it to somebody who's got the slightest twinge in their finger. I mean, really very serious consequences in terms of 300,000 people dead in the United States as a result of becoming addicted to drugs, largely through being wrongly prescribed them. But I almost think that's a kind of an old-fashioned pharmaceutical scandal. That's a pharmaceutical scandal based upon they invent something, they then market it extremely unethically. I think a more modern scandal, which sums up what the pharmaceutical industry has become, is probably a guy called Martin Shkreli. I don't know if people have heard of him. So Martin Shkreli, he's called a farmer bro because he liked hip hop, and he kind of really enjoyed this bad boy reputation. He came from the hedge fund world, and he said, well, I had to leave the hedge fund world because there wasn't enough money in it. So I started a pharmaceutical company. And what he would do is he would go and buy up pharmaceutical products where he thought there was a monopoly. It wasn't strictly intellectual property, but there were monopolies on the stuff he was buying up. And then he'd jack up the price as much as he could. So there was this anti-parasitic drug he brought up, which is very, very important for people with advanced HIV, although also important for pregnant women sometimes too. And he jacked the price up overnight 5,000%. So he became like the most hated man in America for doing this. He managed to unite during the election campaign, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, and Bernie Sanders, who all said this is the most awful man. But he was really interesting because he said, look, you might not like me, but my job isn't to make you like me. My job is to maximize my shareholders' profit. And believe it or not, that's what all of these pharmaceutical companies are doing. I'm not doing anything differently from what all of these pharmaceutical companies are doing. And he was right. I mean, the thing he was doing differently was he did it with a smile on his face. But essentially, his model was the model of the pharmaceutical industry. And I kind of go back and had a look in the book at how all of this came about. And I think, you know, to a degree, Els has described it, but I will point you towards one book I think is really important to read to understand how this happened, and that's Naomi Klein's No Logo, for people who haven't read it. It was a really seminal book. When I was at university, we were all reading it, and we could see the high street changing, so it made sense. She's talking about a change in corporate mentality, essentially, a change in how business operates, and a change that happened in the mid-90s, wherein corporations realized that the real value didn't come from the products they were making, per se. It didn't come from their workers, didn't come from their factories, but came from something intangible. I mean, their brand was the thing she fixed on. You know, so Levi's doesn't make jeans that are any better than anyone else's jeans. They're the same, they're made in the same factories, right? But Levi's has a brand, and that brand is the thing that derives the most value for Levi's. Same with McDonald's, hamburgers the same as anyone else's hamburgers, but the McDonald's brand is really important to the value of that corporation. And I think you can apply that to the pharmaceutical industry. It's not that Pfizer's brand is important, but it has another intangible asset, which is kind of which is the intellectual property. And so at that time, in the mid-90s, there was this realization, that's how we make real value. And so how do we protect that? Well, we lobby for things like TRIPS, so that this is enforced everywhere around the world. And I mean, it's hard to overestimate how important TRIPS was. Because as Els said, at that point, I don't think there was any developing country that had put intellectual property on medicine. Britain didn't put intellectual property on medicine until the Second World War, and we were one of the first, which is not the done thing. What that meant was that countries around the world could no longer, and this applies way beyond medicine, simply work out how a more advanced economy has done something and do it itself. That became theft, that became piracy, but up to that point, that was normal. That was how trade operated. That was the main benefit of countries trading. It's something Ha-Joon has talked about a lot, and I'm sure he'll talk about it when I finish. But it fundamentally changed how developing countries were able to make value, and it had an effect for all of us because that's why the medicine industry today is so concentrated. Other than India, India is the only country that basically has interpreted TRIPS very, very loosely. It's the only country that has a substantial medicine industry. China does too, also interpreted very loosely. And thank God, because without those two countries, most people in the developing world would never have had a vaccine. So that's where they all came from, China and India. So it was a really, really important change, and it led to the South Africa catastrophe that Liz was talking about at the beginning. But it also changed our own corporation, because as Els has pointed out, what it did was, for those corporations, it was no longer important that they had massive productive capacity. It was no longer important they were doing their own research. You can buy that stuff. What's important is your monopoly, the monopoly you hold on whatever it is that you own. And you mentioned the drug Humira, which became kind of cause célèbre because it's so expensive. I mean, over the last 10 years, Humira's cost the NHS £2.7 billion, single drug, highly rational single drug. And I did a little bit of a look and find out what the deal was with Humira and where it had come from. Well, it's produced by AbbVie, big pharmaceutical corporation called AbbVie, but they didn't invent Humira. They bought Humira for $7 billion. They then spent $5 billion on R&D. But R&D doesn't seem to have made the drug any more effective, any easier to take. Essentially, the R&D seems to have been about extending the monopolies, making small changes so that you can apply for new patents and so on. And having done that, they jacked up the price 470%. That was AbbVie's contribution to Humira. So, and you know, these examples go on and on and on, and they've created all the problems that Els talks about, not just for global equity, but for us having a medical system where we can actually produce the drugs that we're going to need over the next 20 years, the replacements for antibiotics or whatever it be. So I'm going to finish by just giving you a few hopeful signs, because it's all very depressing. And I think there is change that's happening. And partly that's a result of COVID, and partly it's a result of our own governments realizing, unless we're going to bankrupt our health systems, we need another way of doing this. So first, very quick example, South Africa, during the COVID pandemic, said we cannot get hold of mRNA vaccines. We want to produce our own. We want to learn how to make them. And they went to the companies, and the companies said, not with us. And so they said, well, we're just going to work it out. And they very quickly worked out how to produce an mRNA vaccine. I mean, they still needed to do loads of testing and trialing, so it wasn't online in time for the pandemic. But because mRNA is potentially a very important platform technology, you can imagine vaccines being created for all sorts of other things, including HIV, TB, malaria, who knows? So they're now working on a TB vaccine. But what they then did was something really radical. They said, we're going to share this with any government in the world who we think can make use of it for free. It's not patented. And they have been engaged in a program of training governments around the world who now have access to mRNA technology. So that was really interesting. It came directly out of the behavior of the pharmaceutical industry, and I think provides some light for how we can begin to do things differently. It's not a perfect system by any manner of means, but it's different. And I think that's really important. The second bit of hope, I think, actually, funnily enough, comes from the belly of the beast, the United States, where I think, for two reasons. I think one, the opioid epidemic has had an unbelievable impact on the American public. I think, well, three reasons. I think secondly, unlike, we have a national health system, I have no idea how much the drugs I get prescribed cost. But in America, they know, because it's itemized on their insurance, and often they can't afford them at all. And thirdly, I genuinely think Biden was shocked to his core about the way the pharmaceutical industry behaved in the pandemic. I mean, he knew that Moderna's vaccine was an American vaccine, was an American public vaccine. They funded it 100%. And yet they wouldn't, Moderna on its patents wouldn't even list the American scientists who worked on that vaccine. So Biden was pretty furious. And I woke up, I don't know, it was like last August, I can't remember. When he finally got the IRA through, he tweeted out, this time we beat Big Pharma. Because as part of the IRA, he didn't get everything he wanted, but he got the ability to negotiate down drug prices for the first time. They'd never been allowed to do that before. The drug companies have been able to do anything they wanted. So he got the ability to do that, and he has begun to do it. And that is big. It's really big. I mean, several pharmaceutical companies have tried to challenge him in court because how dare he try to take away their God-given right to charge whatever they want for a drug. But he's continued with it. And it isn't just at that level. So in California, the government of California has said, so many of our citizens can't get accessible insulin, even though this thing was invented 100 years ago, because of the monopolies on it, so expensive, so they're self-rationing. We are just going to create public production. We're going to create insulin at cost, and we're going to give it to everybody who needs it. And they're doing it. And I think 7 states are thinking they want to do the same thing now, including a Republican state. So this is really big. And there are all manner of smaller examples of how people are beginning to wake up to the idea that intellectual property is not a good way to run our medicine industry. And I would argue very, very finally, it's not a good way to run our economy at all, because what you see with medicines is replicated in all sorts of other parts of the economy. And there's some great work that's been done by Joe Stiglitz and others saying, look, we're supposed to be in a knowledge economy, and yet our entire rules around that economy are about enclosing knowledge and keeping it from people. How it is an economic model for a completely different time at best. And we need to fundamentally change it. And I think you can begin to see those changes. And I think climate change is going to be the thing where we will really need to challenge this, because if we don't want to end up with a bunch of climate technologies controlled by a few enormous monopolies at a global level, actually shared in a way that we can hold this thing fast enough to save the planet, then we are going to need a very, very different way of inventing, of producing, and of distributing.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for ending on some level of positivity. If people have still got energy, we'll go straight to Ha-Joon. I hope he's been able to hear everything that's been said so far. Yeah, I'm going to move so I can see the screen as well. Ha-Joon, you with us?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Yes, sorry everyone, I am down with this nasty disease called shingles, and I really wanted to be there in person, but I just thought I'm not able to, so we'll have to do this on. Well, I think Els and Nick have said almost everything that I wanted to say and a lot more. So I would just be in many ways rehashing what they're saying, but there's one dimension that I want to add to this, which is the historical dimension. The Els's the PowerPoint had this quote from Fleming that I didn't invent penicillin, I just found it. And that was actually behind the pharmaceutical patents until that more or less the Second World War, because the old view, even when countries had patents for chemicals and pharmaceuticals, they had patents for the processes, not for the substances. Yes, I think it's that slightly incorrect to say that there were no pharmaceutical patents. There were patents for the pharmaceutical and chemical industries, but they were about the processes of manufacturing them, not about the substance. Because the argument was exactly what Fleming said, that these substances have always existed in nature. All you have done as a pharmaceutical company researcher is that to find the process to manufacture it. So in all countries, there was no patent for pharmaceuticals and other chemicals as substance. The patent was only for the process. And that actually later plays out very importantly, because when South Africa was taken to its own constitutional court by these 42 Western drug companies in the process that Liz mentioned at the beginning, the point of dispute was, facing the HIV/AIDS crisis, the South African government was basically trying to import all these parallel drugs from countries like Thailand, Brazil, India, which was still in a transition to the TRIPS type of patent system, where they had to allow substance patent for pharmaceuticals and other chemicals. So there was this period between 95 and about 2005, 10, depending on the country, when you could still legally manufacture other people's drugs, so-called, as far as you didn't use the same process. And the South African government realized that in order to keep the HIV positive patient alive for a year with patented Western drugs, it would cost something like $10,000 to $12,000, as Els mentioned, per year, when the country's per capita income was something like $4,000. And they could do that with $300 to $500 if they imported this the drugs, from countries like Thailand, Brazil, and India. So these were called parallel imports, and the pharmaceutical companies took the South African government to the country's constitutional court, citing this the bit in the Constitution, saying that the people have a right to make profit or whatever, yeah, and saying that this the arrangement of parallel import is a violation of that right in Constitution. Of course, there was a huge scandal, and they had such bad publicity in the process, so that they withdrew this lawsuit. But one very, I mean, Els mentioned that kind of this the requirement for health benefit rather than simple originality as a small thing that could be changed and could change the game. But I think the one more and the somewhat bigger thing to change is to abolish or highly restrict the substance pattern when it comes to pharmaceuticals. Yeah? Because in the beginning, no country that accepted substance pattern on pharmaceuticals and other chemicals. Yeah? Another insight from history is that Els in one of the slides talked about patent monopolies. Yeah? Now, people used to be more honest. Yeah? In the old days, patents were called patent monopolies. Yeah? Because it was artificially created monopolies, maybe within certain boundaries that socially useful monopolies, but still monopolies. So it was called monopolies, yeah, for what it is, yeah. I mean, in the old days, no country had the Ministry of Defense. They all had the Ministry of War because that's what they do, yeah. So, I mean, we need to call a spade, that this is a socially created monopoly. And basically, we have to ask whether this the protection that societies provide to the patent holders is worth the money. I'm not, actually in favor of completely abolishing patents. If you design it well and use it for certain things, that it has that usefulness. But basically, we need to ask whether the system as we have it is good value for money. Yeah? So first of all, you have to realize that this the refrain from the pharmaceutical industry, like it or not, Nick said it, Els said it, that you need us. This is a total lie. Yeah? Even by the admission of the U.S. Pharmaceutical Industry Association, they since then since about mid 2000s took down that statistics from their website because probably they found it too embarrassing. But when I looked at it in like mid 2000s, even in the U.S., supposedly the private-driven economy, the pharmaceutical industry was financing only about 45% of the entire the nation's the drugs research. Yeah? The other 30% came from the government, 25% from the charities and universities and other non-profit organizations. So even if you completely abolish the patents, more than half of the drugs research will happen. Yeah? And a lot more will happen if there are these pharmaceutical industries disappear. So actually, we don't need them. Yeah? So that we have to call their bluff. Yeah? And during that debate on the South African case, there was a very interesting letter by 13 fellows of Royal Society, the highest scientific society in Britain, which said that these pharmaceutical companies say that without the profit given through intellectual property right, that there will be no drugs research. We totally disagree with it. A lot of people do research purely out of curiosity. Even more people do this research in order to help the world, not for money. Yeah. So actually, this the distortion that these people make of our motives is completely objectionable. Yeah. So they are not really necessary. Well, especially when it comes to things like the pharmaceutical the products, but also you have to realize that how more expensive this system has become compared to even in the old days. Yeah. So first of all, you have this the substance the patterns which create more monopoly, more the problems. Yeah. But you have to also realize that the pattern life has been extended. Yeah. Never mind the kind of this fake patent thing that Els talked about. But when the intellectual property rights, the patent system was first set up in the late 18th century in some countries, the length of protection, length of monopoly was only 14 years. Yeah, apparently based on the notion that this is twice the length of worker apprenticeship. Yeah. And then 14 became 17 and then 20. And now pharmaceutical industries that have found ways to extend it to effectively 28 years by demanding the right to protect data, the extra time they need, unlike other industries in doing clinical trials. So actually they effectively get that even without those tricks that Els was talking about, they effectively can get up to 28 years. Yeah? So why do they need 28 when it used to be 14, 20? Yeah? So you have to realize that this extension of patent life itself is a problem. Also, the huge public subsidies that they get. I'm very glad that Els and Nick pointed out that how much of this the COVID vaccine that was financed by public money. It's a quite complicated picture, but depending on the estimate you get, it is at least 80%, possibly up to 95% of this money that came from the public sector and the charities. Yeah. So the drugs industry that at most spent 20% of the research money. I mean, and I'm not even talking about the historical research, and then they get all the benefit. Huh? And then else that the point is out that the profit does multiplied by many times, yeah, through this lowering of the originality bar, extension of the patent lifetime, manipulation of the government the funding system, all this, they are now leaking out. Maybe that this is why the U.S. Pharmaceutical Industry Association doesn't publish the numbers anymore. I mean, I haven't really seriously worked on the intellectual property issues in the last 10, 15 years, but I'm sure that you can somehow extract this number, but maybe it's not even 45% now. Maybe only 20% of drugs research is done by these pharmaceutical companies because they're spending so much on, share buybacks and the dividends and, the marketing and, the Bill Lazonik's work shows that, many of these companies very often did share buybacks that were even bigger than their profit. Yeah? So they're actually borrowing money to give money to shareholders, basically hollowing the company out. Yeah? And last but not least, now these patents are actually becoming more of an obstacle to innovation rather than spurs to innovation, because now every little piece of gene can be patented. You know, you need an army of lawyer to do any new research. I mean, I tell this story about the famous golden rice, whose the inventors kind of gave up their sold this technology to the Syngenta, the for-profit company, on the ground that in order to make this the technology that commercially available, they needed to negotiate something like 70, possibly up to 100 patents. And they said that we are scientists, we are not lawyers, we cannot do this. Yeah. So actually now that you know, as more and more minute the pieces of technology become patentable, now actually you know, the patent the system is not even encouraging innovation. I mean that to whatever little extent it used to. Yeah? So yeah, this is a bankrupt system. Once again, I'm not saying that we need to completely abolish it. I mean, we just need to kind of introduce a new framework. And but let me finish with this remark that even within the current system, you can actually do a lot of things. I mean, this is the sad thing. I mean, the governments don't know to scared or brought up by the pharmaceutical industry into not even using this. Yeah, there is this compulsory licensing arrangement. Yeah, which the U.S. used that in order to get the huge concession from Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company that which at the time had the patent on this drug called Cipro, the anti-anthrax drug, when there was this anthrax scare following the 9/11. Yeah? This means that basically for public purposes, the government can force the patent holder to license the technology with a reasonable fee to other people to produce the more whatever drug they need. Yeah, because if this company wants to make high profit, they don't have incentive to produce more of these drugs. Yeah, so this compulsory licensing arrangement, you know, parallel imports. Yeah. The one that the South Africa is trying to use. So, you know, I mean, the system needs reform, but as Nick suggested, there are already people doing things within the existing framework to do things differently. And anyway, I mean, you know, I have basically repeated many of the things that the Els and Nick said, but I think the most important thing is to call the bluff of the pharmaceutical industry and say that no, we actually do not need you, especially if you are going to behave like this, and especially if you are going to distort the system in such a that you don't even now have what little justification you used to have, but indeed the old regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'm just reflecting, I failed on two fronts tonight. I failed to keep this very well to time. And all that stuff I said about the beginning about different perspectives, I've never seen such a level of agreement in a panel. So yeah, we'll have to try harder with that. I have all kinds of questions. My biggest question is, given the level of agreement, you know, patents need to go, pharmaceutical companies need to go, public subsidies need to go, you know, we need a new framework. I personally would like to ask the panel, what why hasn't that happened? What's the biggest obstacle to making that happen? Because I can even sense in the room, as Ha-Joon's saying, you know, we need to call the bluff of pharmaceutical companies. There's almost like nervous laughter. It's like, yeah, well, that's not going to happen, is it? You know, it's like, really? So that would be my question. What do you really see as the biggest obstacle? It feels very, the conversation feels very idealistic, I suppose. And yeah, so how do we get from the one place to the next? But I would really like, if people have still got, you know, 20 minutes or so to stick with us, given you've stuck with us this long, I'd really like to open up the floor, that there are mics above, so you don't need to wait for a mic to come for you. But are there questions here, ideally from a woman first? Please go ahead.
This is for everyone, but also
Els?
you I need my notes now, but you mentioned some countries removing the ability to patent drugs, like it might have been pre-1950s. What happens if some countries do that and other countries don't, in terms of, yeah, availability of drugs, access to new technology, and so forth? Are there, yeah, what are the reasons that's not happening, and what would happen if they did? Let's say the UK did it, or any country.
Okay, the questions, please.
Thanks. A lot of the conversation today in the room reminded me of, in terms of also the solutions, reminded me a bit of Mariana Mazzucato's like Mission Economy latest book. So I'm wondering, as we're moving forwards toward a solution and kind of like thinking of the mission economy concept, how do we, or how do governments actually get there, the private sector cooperate to, you know, to making the, like say the health pharmaceutical industry actually work for the common good and not the other way around?
Sure, go ahead. Sorry, can I just check? Ha-Joon, can you hear the questions?
Yeah, I can.
Good, right, I was going to write them down.
Yeah.
Please.
MSF was very much involved in access to medicine for the last 25 years or so. So they have quite a lot of, and then was T-Boyd. She was the chair of the during those days. And at that time, for point of time, there was quite a lot of lobbying, quite a lot of, because HIV/AIDS was, pandemic was at its peak, or whatever you call it. But the one thing that has come out from that campaign, for example, is that about the compulsory licensing and parallel imports. So what, as this professor has already pointed out, what is the problem with compulsory licensing? Why cannot any country can do it right now? Compulsory licensing. And if they are not producing it, you can do the parallel importing. Yes. If I understand it correctly, I'm a public health specialist, but I don't deal with this anymore. And if the for example, HIV medication is already 20 years old, so the patent life is finished. So why can't you don't even need the compulsory licensing for that? All you need is it can be automatically becomes generic, right? After 20 years. So what is the problem with that in terms of compulsory licensing, parallel importing, as well as in terms of patent life, which has been expired? And why can't they get why can't the countries can do that? Yeah, compulsory licensing or produce generics. And second question, very quickly, is that do you think the greatest bulk buyers are Gavi and UNICEF, yeah, Gavi mainly Gavi, which is actually in private sector. It's kind of private sector, yeah. It's a PPP, public-private partnership, but the point is that it's not UN. So Gavi as well as Global Fund. Both Global Fund is the major buyer for HIV/AIDS and Gavi is vaccinations along with UNICEF. Do you think that having these private sector and public-private partnerships are incentivizing the patent monopoly, or they are actually defining, they are actually against it, or they're actually challenging it? What do you? These are the good questions. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Okay, I think, are there other questions? Oh, sorry, go ahead. And then I'll do another round if people keep going, if you want to ask another question.
Yes, thank you very much. I learned a lot. I think the main takeaways that I learned is that it seems that they're not investing into innovations, that even some drugs that we need aren't being, the supply isn't there, and the drugs are becoming more expensive, and that it's patented. It seems like these problems are coming from it being a free, coming from the free markets. And so my question would be, so it seems that the government needs to step in. What would your recommendations be? How should the government step in? And if we get rid of patents, how do we balance, that we're incentivizing still, the science to innovate in the right direction?
So that's a really interesting group of questions, quite a lot, I think, for you, Els, but some of the bigger picture questions also, maybe you can take some of the more technical questions, but I'll do Els and then Nick and then Ha-Joon and just pick what you would like to answer, and then we'll see where we're at. And don't forget my question. What's your question? I want to know what's the biggest obstacle to get from where we are to what you guys are all kind of saying is like the most logical place that we should be.
Okay, well, there was a lot of questions. Thank you so much. Great questions, all of them. I'll start with the first one. What if certain countries would, for instance, the UK, etc. The first thing is today, since the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement, countries are no longer able or allowed to do that because they all signed that they were going to abide by this 20-year standards. But putting that aside, because it was different in the past, and it was different because the point I was making is that patents, intellectual property rights are a tool, are a policy tool, and countries have chosen, depending on their stage of development or their industrial priorities or health priorities, to use that differently. And that was the beauty of the system before, that actually, and for instance, India is a very good example where there was a very conscious intellectual property industrial policy to say, well, we are going to invest in our industrial capability of re-engineering. That's why they became such a great generics producer. But then they fashioned their industrial policy and intellectual property and whatever such that they gave incentives to that chemical engineering, re-engineering industry to make generics. And they could, until then the TRIPS agreement, and they, through the transition period, I think it was 2005 or something, by the time they had to also have product patents, but as was already said, before it was different, and some countries chose to do it differently. So today, if a country says, we want to prioritize public health, and we don't think it would be good to have patent monopolies on critical medicines or vaccines, they could even say only for epidemic and pandemic preparedness, because there is a pandemic treaty being discussed, and that's kind of on the table. It's not going to happen, but it could be. So if countries, and I don't think it's a matter of then competitive advantage, because the point is it's for health, it's not for your economy, and then you can do whatever you want.
Just to clarify, are you saying currently countries would have to collaborate on a new treaty? Or they could already do this? Because I'm a bit confused with TRIPS.
They can't today. They can't.
Okay. So they would need to renegotiate the treaty. Okay.
But the good news, to say something positive, is that there is a request for a review of a TRIPS agreement. It's going to be 30 years of TRIPS agreement. Colombia has put that on the table, and many developing countries are supporting to see, because the premise, as I said at some point, is like patents are there to stimulate innovation and dissemination of technology, but that's kind of balance doesn't seem to have been struck, and I think that developing countries are putting that on the table. Can we reassess whether the policy that we put in place has achieved the goal that it was intended? And I think the answer, if they ever agree to do that review, I think the answer is kind of clear. The problem is, and then I'm going to quickly come to your question, for me the biggest obstacle is power. And power, I mean, power, hegemonic power of the wealthy countries and the financial elites. For them, this works very well because it's so extractive. They are enriching personally the firms, the whatever capital is making so much more money. So why would they change? So yeah. Going to maybe leave some others and then I can come back. Also the question on MSF, because just for you to know, I was myself the director of the Access campaign for a couple of years more recently, so I can respond to that. But maybe first a little.
So, I mean, I was going to say power too, but maybe let's expand on it. So there's the vested interest. You know, I've always said the pharmaceutical industry works brilliantly if you're an investor in the pharmaceutical industry. You know, if your aim is not producing new innovative affordable medicines, yeah, it works very, very well. But I think that fits into a broader economic paradigm that we've lived under for the last 40 years now, which is about competitiveness. Now, when people hear about international competitiveness, they think it refers to different companies competing within an economy. It doesn't mean that at all. It's the opposite of that. It means countries competing against each other for investment and capital. Yeah. And then countries having, it completely changes where power lies in society. And so today, if you're a government and you come in and you start doing this, the immediate thing you face is threats from all of these companies. We're going to leave, we're going to take the jobs with us, we're going to take the investment with us. And that scares governments because in order to counter that, you have to have a very strong set of industrial policies. You know, you have to put, you know, you probably do have to put more public money on the table for this kind of stuff. I think it would be well worth it. But it's convincing people who are still in a kind of neoliberal frame of thinking. But I do think there's a change here. I mean, you know, and Ha-Joon Chang, you've written obviously about industrial policy, and I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say on that, because, you know, for me, my whole life, we've not been able to say the words industrial policy until a few years ago. And now it's back and everyone says you've got to do it, right? But the question then is what industrial policy? And we've worked a lot with Mariana Mazzucato, so she really supports, you know, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about here. But the problem is, you know, that we have a Labour government in this country that claims to be inspired by Mariana Mazzucato, and they've got missions and all this kind of stuff. I think they fundamentally misunderstand her. You know, when she talks about missions, she's not talking about a kind of public-private partnership where you sit down and have a discussion about what's best for everyone. She's talking about the government putting money and power on the table and saying we set the terms. And within these terms there are incentives. Of course there are incentives. No one's saying you're going to work for free on this. Of course there are incentives of how you can make a reasonable profit within this. And in terms of what those incentives are, there's lots of discussion around that, but there are discussions for kind of prize funds. There are discussions that are actually happening even in antibiotics around the Netflix model. So you don't pay for individual, you don't pay for the amount of drugs, you pay for access to drugs. There's various things like that, but it all requires economic planning. Right? Which governments, although they claim they are back in that space, I think haven't really grasped it. And if you look at, you know, for example, what Keir Starmer's government here is saying on reforming you know, he's saying we need to put more money into R&D, but if anything, he's strengthening intellectual property in doing it, right? He's kind of giving the companies whatever they want rather than setting the terms. He's admitted it's a very unbalanced sector dominated by big corporations. Very, very difficult to sustain yourself as a small pharmaceutical company today. Your business model is you get bought up by somebody. I've even spoken to small pharmaceutical business people who say, yeah, I want to get bought up by Pfizer. How else am I going to make any money? But his goal is to like actually make it easier for university departments to spin out their research. Well, that already happens. It's the same. It's more of the same, right? Just with even more public money put in. So I think, you know, that you really need a strong industrial policy that will get you to that point. And the one thing I will add is to that is manufacturing. So I do think the state has to have manufacturing capacity. I do not think the state has to produce every medicine that we take, of course not. But I do think we need some backup, because when COVID happened, I mean, the one thing where the one justification that I think Western decision makers have in their favor, I do sympathize with them, is we couldn't make this stuff ourselves. We were reliant on them. At the end of the day, they had us, right? Because they'd scaled back their manufacturing because it wasn't that important to them, but we hadn't put anything in place to replace it. So at the end of the day, you have to have some manufacturing capability. And on your points, Gavi, and yeah, I mean, look, the point at which these kind of philanthropic, but private philanthropic organizations evolved, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I talk about it in the book a bit, but it is that point in history where the World Health Organization was clearly being defunded, when politically defunded and derailed. I think we would have a very different world if all of that hadn't happened. And these organizations filled that, came in and filled that space, but with a very private sector mentality. So Bill Gates loves intellectual property. He's done very well out of it, to be fair, right? But it's interesting, right? Because he's kind of admitting there's a major dysfunction here. He loves the market, he loves intellectual property. He's kind of admitting the market won't do this. That's why I'm pouring all of this money in. But then he doesn't take the next step because he won't go against that system ultimately. So ultimately what Gavi does is it pays way more than the odds, rather than supporting new local manufacturing, new local research. They just support the big pharma companies. Yeah, they get a bit of a discount because they bulk purchase, but essentially you're feeding the same system. You're not genuinely transforming it. And I think that is a big problem we've got internationally. And one of the things we have to push for at the moment is people like whatever the problems with Gavi and however much we'd like something else, and that's, you know, we can work on that too. They have to be purchasing from southern manufacturing. They have to be purchasing from factories and so on that are not under the control of big pharma. They are moving a little bit on that, but it's going to take a lot more work for sure.
I think that's interesting because that's always been the answer, hasn't it, from the big pharmaceutical companies, is to discount to protect intellectual property rights. But when something big happens, whether it's COVID or whatever, then to give some crumbs or, you know, discount for a bit, but to keep the system in place. Ha-Joon, want to come in?
Yeah, no, I mean, what can I say? I mean, basically, why is this not happening? I mean, yeah, you have to ask the classic question asked by the Roman orator Cicero, or the Cicero in English, qui bono, yeah, who benefits, yeah. I mean, it's that not the working because it benefits the people with power and money. And yeah, I mean, so the solution has to be political, you know? You know, Nick already said something about this, but this kind of private charity-driven models, you know, yeah, okay. I mean, it's better than nothing, but I'm really against that. You know, these being the main solution, because it means that a small number of, you know, very wealthy individuals are not who are not accountable to the general public are going to determine our public policy. Huh? So that we have to, yeah, no, I'm not against it, you know, but you have to put it in the right place. So yes, we need, as Nick said, a completely different approach to the economy. I mean, especially in this area, we know that the tweaking of the existing system is not going to work. But you know, when you think about it, I mean, the trips and all these things, I mean, they are not like laws of nature. Huh? It's man-made things, and they can be changed. We might change them. Of course, there's the political challenge. I mean, how do you, fight these people who put huge amount of money and intellectual resource and marketing resource and campaign resource to defend their interests. So, you know, there are, of course, there's a mere academic stump, but unless we all realize what's going on and begin to voice our concerns and anger, that things are not going to change. And, you know, that's the only the thing that will ultimately change it. This notion of mission, I don't know. I mean, yes, I mean it's it can be quite an effective mechanism, but the problem is, I mean, how do you define our mission? Yeah, is that the UK government's mission, the improvement in general, the well-being, or is it the health improvement, or is it reducing drug prices and so on? So, you know, really, I mean, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, you have to define your mission well. Simply having a mission that doesn't mean anything, because you could have the wrong mission, or the mission could be so kind of broad it becomes completely impossible to implement it, or it is so narrow that it kind of neglects other important issues. So, you know, I'm I mean, the worry that simply having a mission that doesn't mean that you are going to do anything right. Yeah, but yes, I mean that I understand why, you know, having a mission could be very, very effective for particular things like sending people to the moon, or developing, you know, the COVID vaccine with kind of unprecedented speed and so on. Yeah, I mean, but you have to realize that the mission has to be defined in the right way. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, it's nearly 7 o'clock. Unless anybody's got a really pressing question, I think, which nobody has, which I think will draw this to a close. It's been such a fascinating conversation. I feel like we've just only kind of touched the surface of some of these problems. I hope it hasn't been too depressing. There was a lot there to cling on to, and hopefully to light a bit of a fire in the bellies of the participants.
Can I make one final, after hearing all this? Of course, we're in London, we're in the UK here, but my optimism comes from the work that I'm doing with countries in the global south, Brazil, Thailand, and others. And I think we also have to realize, I mean, the hegemonic powers that be, that we all just reiterated, that are in control of the current system and benefit from it, they're not going to, you know, just give that up for free. So, but I think that increasingly certain countries in the global south, certainly those that have some capabilities. I mean, Brazil, they have state-owned vaccine and medicine manufacturing. And I mean, there are a number of other countries that have, Bangladesh, Indonesia, etc. And they're, after COVID, they are actually angry, because they feel they have been let down by their friends in the global north. And I think when you see the policy discussions, they're struggling, of course, because powers that be are behaving like powers that be. But I think that we need to try to find ways to decrease the powers here and seek ways in which they can be more powerful in trying to create solutions for them. Because most of the inequities, etc., are, I mean, they're suffering from that. And so I think things are happening there. And so for me, that's kind of where I put my hope, much less than what happens in the US or in the UK or in Europe that have been.
And power is never given, it's always taken.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good note to end on, because the more countries are doing their own thing, the more that they're proving whatever, calling the pharmaceutical companies bluff, as Ha-Joon said, and the more that they're prepared to like get angry, for example, at the WTO, if that TRIPS review thing happens, then I think we could begin to see step change. And then it'll be our job to be allies and be ready to amplify their voices. But just join me to thank our panel once again, and thank you again.
And wishing you very well, Ha-Joon.
Eh?
Wishing you.
Oh,
recovery.
thank you, yeah. So sorry not to be able to, yeah, see you in person and,
Next time.
hope, yeah, we will, yeah, try to see each other soon, yeah.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye.
Oh, yes, it's good to see you. I hadn't, were you in the room? I hadn't seen you from there. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, nothing that you didn't know. But I enjoy, especially now I.